The wind came down from the high moor with a sound like tearing cloth. It rattled the shutters of Whitmore Hall and sent the last of the day's light scudding across the great hall's flagstones. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the window slit, a hand resting on the cold stone, and watched the sky bruise into evening. Matilda Croft's voice reached her from the doorway. "A rider, my lady," Neville badge on his shoulder. "Pony half dead under him." Eleanor turned. Matilda's raw-boned face was set in the way that meant trouble. "Tell me," says Hexam has fallen. "The Queen's army is broken. King Henry fled north, God help him." Matilda crossed herself, the gesture quick and automatic. "The rider says we're to watch for stragglers. Deserters. Any who'd trade on our charity and then cut our throats." "Of course!" Eleanor's mind already moved past the news, tallying dangers. Her husband 3 years dead, her son Benjamin far away in York as a hostage to the King's peace, and Whitmore Hall sitting precisely on the fault line between York and Lancaster. She had learned to hold still while the ground shifted, see the rider fed and watered, offer him a bed in the stable. And Matilda, no word of this to anyone yet. "The servants will panic." "Aye, my lady." The door shut, and Eleanor stood alone for a moment, measuring the weight of the news. Hexam lost. The last Lancastrian field army shattered. If the Yorkists chose to press their advantage, this hall would be an island in a hostile sea. She thought of Benjamin, 9 years old, and eating his supper in some merchant's house in York, unaware that his mother's world had just tilted again. Then a second knock came, harder and more urgent. Dickon, the stable boy, stood panting in the corridor, his face as white as new cheese. "My lady, there's a man in the byre. Matilda says, come quick. He's bleeding hard." The byre smelled of wet wool and beast, a lantern guttered on a hook throwing jittering shadows across the straw. Matilda crouched beside a shape that at first seemed no more than a heap of dark cloth. Then the heap groaned and a hand fluttered up, pale as candle wax. Eleanor knelt, the straw pricking through her gown. The man was young, perhaps 25, with a swordsman's build run to thinness. His dark hair was matted with sweat, and his eyes, grey-green like the sea before a storm, opened slowly, finding her face. "Lady, forgive me. I am a poor man, a man-at-arms from the West Country. I did not ask." He choked, and blood flecked his lips. Matilda had already cut away his tunic, revealing a wound low in his side, a sucking tear that told Eleanor all she needed to know about his chances. The wool underneath was stained a brutal red, and on his chest, half hidden by the torn cloth, was the device of a sun in splendour, a Yorkist badge. "You're a long way from your lines," Eleanor said softly, keeping her voice steady. "Who did this to you?" "Hargrave's men." The name came out as a rasping sigh. "Sir Robert Hargrave. He has orders. From the King. They were to kill us. All of us." Matilda shot Eleanor a look over the injured man's body. Hargrave was their neighbour, a Yorkist knight who had twice petitioned the King for Whitmore lands. If he was riding around the moor exacting the King's justice, justice might soon come knocking at the hall. "All of who?" Eleanor pressed. "You're a man-at-arms. Prisoners can be ransomed." "Not men. Children." The soldier's grey-green eyes welled with something that might have been tears or simply the sweat of agony. "The King's writ orders every Lancastrian male heir executed. Squires, pages, boys. I saw it. I saw them smile about it. I can't carry it to hell. Please, my lady, take it." His hand fumbled at his belt, and a folded square of parchment, creased and stained with sweat, slipped into Eleanor's palm. She did not need to unfold it to recognize the weight of a royal seal, but she broke the wax anyway, tilting the paper toward the lantern. The words swam in the unsteady light. "Edward, by the grace of God, King of England and France, to all his lieges, that the male issue of all who bore arms against us at Hexam be put to the sword, without quarter, without mercy." Matilda read over her shoulder, her breath hissing out through her teeth. "Holy Mother of God." Eleanor's hands trembled, but she folded the writ with deliberate care. "You took this from Hargrave? I was his courier, I carried it. But I could not." The soldier coughed, and the sound was wet, final. "My name is William Ashby. I have a daughter, Margaret, 5 years old. She lives with my sister in a village outside Ripon. I am no deserter, I swear it. I was cut off from my company. But I could not be the man who delivered that order. Please, my lady, you must get it into Lancastrian hands. The Bishop of Durham. He can send copies abroad. To France, Burgundy, the Scots. If they know what Edward has done, God's wounds, but he will not be able to find a single ally left in Christendom." Eleanor stared at the parchment in her hands. It was a key and a weapon and a death sentence all at once. She thought of Benjamin, alone in York, and the thought hardened into a knot of ice in her chest. If this writ was true, then her son was already a hostage, and that hostage worth had just become a target. "There's more," William Ashby whispered, his voice thinning. "Hargrave's men planted something here. A Yorkist surcoat. The red one, with the sun on it. They hid it under a loose stone in the undercroft. They meant to find it later. To prove you were sheltering enemy soldiers. To attaint you for treason and seize the hall. The rage came then, cold and clarifying. Eleanor had spent 3 years building a careful neutrality, a silence that kept Whitmore from being swallowed by men like Hargrave. And he had ordered a grave dug for her, furnished it with false proof, and only waited to push her in. "Show me," she said. It took Dickon's shaking hands and Matilda's steady ones to shift the stone. Wrapped in oilcloth was a crimson wool surcoat, the sun in splendor stitched in gold thread. It was stained with blood, probably the blood of the man who had worn it before it was taken as a trophy. Hargrave had been thorough. Eleanor held the foul cloth in her hands, and the weight of it seemed to pull at her arms. "Burn it," Matilda said flatly. "Now, before anyone sees." No, Eleanor folded the surcoat, wrapped it again in oilcloth, and replaced it beneath the stone. "It is evidence. A knife can cut both ways. If Hargrave wants to play at frames and falsehoods, he has given me the very thing that will damn him when the truth comes out. Keep it hidden, but do not destroy it." She returned to the byre, where William Ashby's breathing had grown shallow. His grey-green eyes tracked her as she knelt beside him again. "My daughter," he murmured, "you will promise me you will hide my part in this. Say I was a courier, a messenger. Anything but what I did." Eleanor took his cold hand. "The writ will speak its own truth, but your name, your daughter's name, I will keep from every tongue that tells this story. This I swear." He tried to smile. "I was a carpenter before the war. I made stools and bed frames. I was not a man who did such things." Then the breath went out of him with a long, rattling sigh, and his hand went slack in hers. Eleanor closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moaned around the walls. She found Henry Whitmore in the hall, stripping off his riding gloves. Her cousin was tall and lean, with hair the colour of winter straw and pale, watery blue eyes that lit at the sight of her. He had ridden in not half an hour before the Neville messenger, dusty and triumphant. The battle at Hexham had gone ill for Lancaster, but Henry had fought his way clear and vanished into the moors with a handful of men. He was still buzzing with the energy of survival. "Eleanor, you look like you've seen a ghost." "I have, and I am asking you to carry his message." She handed him the writ. Henry read it, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock to a cold, flinty fury. Edward signed this. It was not a question. His own hand and seal. "William Ashby, a Yorkist courier, brought it to me before he died. He said Hargrave's men were hunting Lancastrian survivors on the moor, executing the wounded as per those orders. Children, Henry. And Hargrave has eyes on this hall," Henry said, thinking aloud. "If he is already planting evidence, he is a Yorkist surcoat in the Undercroft. I have not touched it except to verify its existence. It is waiting for a search." Henry's jaw tightened. "Neutrality is a fiction, Eleanor. The hounds of York will sniff you out eventually. You carry our name. It's time to honour it. I am not asking for a sermon on courage. I am asking if you will ride to the Bishop of Durham with this writ. Tonight. Now." He studied her for a long moment. "And if I do, the bishop has the network to send copies by sea to France, Burgundy, and the Scots. If this murderous order becomes known abroad, King Edward will find his alliances shattered. That writ is a weapon that could end his war before the year is out. And leave you here alone, with Hargrave's men sniffing at your gates. I have Matilda. I have a few stout tenants, and I have the advantage of knowing what they intend before they know I know. I will hold." Henry laughed, a short, grim sound. "You would have the truth walk on parchment feet when it should ride in armour. Then ride with it." Eleanor pressed the writ into his hand. "I will reach the bishop," he said. "I swear it on my sword and on my soul. The king's crime will not stay hidden." He drew her into a brief, fierce embrace, and then he was gone, calling for his horse. Later, when the hall had settled into an uneasy quiet and the Neville rider had been bedded down in the stables, Eleanor stood alone in the chapel. The carvings of St. Cuthbert watched her from the wall. Somewhere behind that panel, the priest hole waited, empty now but ready for dark purposes. She thought of the surcoat hidden below, of the note Henry carried north, of the dead Yorkist, in the byre whom Matilda and Dickon were now burying, in the wet earth beyond the orchard wall. She had been a careful woman for 10 years, obeying first her father, then her husband, then the silence that kept this estate from being swallowed by men like Hargrave. That sense ended tonight. She had held a dying man's hand and promised to keep his daughter's name secret. She had sent her cousin riding into the dark with evidence that could topple a king. She had become, in the space of a single evening, a conspirator against the crown. Eleanor Whitmore lifted her chin and felt the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders like a mantle. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside the chapel, the air was still. She knelt before the altar, not to pray, but to think. The game had changed, and she would have to learn its new rules quickly. Tomorrow she would know more. Tonight she would sleep with a sword under her pillow and a plan already forming in the cold forge of her mind. The writ was on its way. The blood surcoat was hidden, and all across the moor, men were hunting with tarnished pewter eyes and knives sharpened for children. She would not let them reach her door unchallenged. The undercroft was cold, colder than it had been when William lay there. Eleanor descended the stone steps with a candle in one hand, and the other pressed flat against the damp wall for balance. The flame guttered and bent with her movement, throwing jittering shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Matilda had come to her in the orchard not half an hour past, her raw-boned face drawn tighter than usual. "There's another one, my lady, a man." Robert found him in the ditch by the north pasture, half drowned in the runoff from the moor. "He's been asking for you, asking for me by name, by title. He said he knew you would give him shelter." Matilda's voice had carried no approval, only weary duty. "He's in the undercroft now. I've bound his wound, but he's fevered. He talks." The man lay on the same pallet where William had died. For a moment, Eleanor could not look at him. She fixed her eyes instead on the loose stone in the floor, where the Yorkist surcoat still lay hidden in oilcloth, a piece of evidence that could hang her entire household. Then she drew a breath, set the candle on the shelf, and knelt beside the stranger. He was not young. Perhaps 40, with a face that had been handsome once and was now carved hollow by hardship. His hair was the colour of wet sand, plastered to a high forehead, and his eyes, when he opened them, were the murky brown of river water after a flood. A soldier's eyes, she thought, the eyes of a man who had seen things he could not unsee. "You are Lady Whitmore," he said. It was not a question. His voice scraped like a blade on stone. "I am, and you are a stranger on my land, with a wound under your ribs that someone gave you with intent. Who are you?" He tried to sit up, failed, and fell back against the straw-stuffed pallet. The bandages beneath his torn tunic showed a thin red line already soaking through. "My name is Thomas Holbrook. I was a man-at-arms under Sir Robert Hargrave's command. I deserted." The name hit her like a slap. Hargrave. The man who had come to Whitmore Hall a month after her husband's death, all false sympathy and cold calculation, offering her the protection of his name in exchange for her estate. She had refused him, politely but firmly, and he had not forgiven it. He had been circling ever since, waiting for her to stumble. "You served Robert Hargrave," she said, and her voice was flat. "And you came here, to my land." "Why?" Thomas Holbrook closed his eyes. His breath came in shallow sips, each one costing him. "Because I heard you were a woman who did not turn away the dying. And I am dying, my lady. I can feel it. The wound has soured." Eleanor leaned closer. The candlelight caught the sheen of sweat on his cheeks, the grey pallor beneath. It was the same colour William had worn before the end. She did not contradict him. "Then speak," she said. "If you have something to say, say it now." "I carried the order," he whispered. 2 days ago, a sealed letter from the king's own hand sent through Lord Hastings to Hargrave. I did not open it. I am no clerk, but Hargrave read it aloud in his tent. He wanted his captains to know. He wanted witnesses. Eleanor's breath stilled. "What order?" "A party of Lancastrian nobles is coming south under a flag of truce. They seek terms, an end to the killing, a pardon for what remains of their house. The king has agreed to meet them on the moor, 3 miles east of here, at dawn tomorrow. He will offer them bread and salt and his royal word." Thomas's hand groped for hers and she let him take it. His grip was weak but urgent, the fingers cold as church silver. "It is a lie," he said. "There will be no parley. The king's men will fall on them the moment they disarm. They will slaughter them to the last squire, to the last page. And then they will plant evidence. False letters, a Yorkist surcoat, a report from a paid witness. To say that the Lancastrians were ambushed on your land, that your household gave them shelter and sent them to their deaths." The undercroft seemed to tilt around her. The flame guttered again, and for a heartbeat Eleanor saw William's face in the shadows, his grey-green eyes closing for the last time. The surcoat, the hidden surcoat. It was meant to be planted all along. Dryden's search had been real, but it was only the first pass. Hargrave would send more men. He would find what he needed to find. "Hargrave," she said. The name tasted like iron in her mouth. "He wants your estate," Thomas said. "He has petitioned the king for it twice since your husband died. The king denied him both times. Too blatant a theft, too many other lords would object. But if you are attainted as a traitor, if your lands are forfeit to the crown," he coughed, and a thread of blood ran from the corner of his mouth, "then the king can grant them to Hargrave as a reward. Clean, legal. A traitor's property to a loyal servant." Eleanor rose. Her legs were unsteady, but she forced them to hold her. The candle flame steadied as she stepped back, and she saw her own shadow stretch across the wall like a blade. "Why did you desert?" she asked. "You were Hargrave's man. Why risk your life to warn me?" Thomas's eyes opened again. and for a moment the murky brown cleared to something sharper, something that burned. I carried that order, my lady. I saw them smile at the thought of dead children. I can't carry it to hell. The words landed like stones in still water. Eleanor felt them sink through her, down into the place where she had buried her neutrality beneath the orchard grass. A party of Lancastrian nobles, she repeated, coming south under a flag of truce. You know their route. They will pass within a mile of your northern boundary. The old drover's road, the one that cuts through the heather. They mean to reach the moor by nightfall and make camp before the parley. His voice was fading now, each word a little further away. If you can reach them before dawn, you can warn them. You can save them. And if I do, Eleanor said slowly, Hargrave loses his ambush. He loses his evidence. He loses his reward. Yes, and the king's plot, the massacre of men under truce, the false attainder, the seizure of my land, it all becomes public. It becomes a weapon in Lancastrian hands. Thomas smiled. It was a terrible smile, the smile of a man who knew he would not live to see the outcome but had made his peace with that. My lady, you are thinking like a commander. I was told you were a fence-sitter. A trimmer. I was, she said, until this morning. She looked at the loose stone in the floor one more time. Then she turned and climbed the stairs, leaving the candle burning behind her. In the great hall above, the household was quiet. The Yorkist pennant still flew from the gatehouse. Henry's note was still in her purse, unburned. And somewhere out on the moor, a group of Lancastrian nobles were riding toward a trap that would doom them and destroy everything she had spent 3 years protecting. Eleanor Whitmore walked to the hearth and took down the sword that had hung above the mantel since the day they buried her husband. It was heavier than she remembered. The steel was cold and dark, but it was clean. Matilda, she called, not looking away from the blade. Find Robert Harclay. Tell him to saddle my horse. Tell him to bring a second lantern and a sharpening stone. There was a pause. Then Matilda's voice came from the doorway, steady and unsurprised. Where are we riding, my lady? To find the Lancastrians, Eleanor said. Before Robert Hargrave's knives find them first. The great hall had settled into a waiting silence, the kind that pressed against the timbers and made the rushlights gutter in their sconces. Eleanor Whitmore stood with her husband's sword still in her hand, the blade cold against her palm, while Matilda Croft paused at the threshold with a lantern in her raw-boned grip. Not the horses yet, Eleanor said. First, I need Robert Harclay. Matilda's face, seamed by weather, tightened with question, but she nodded and vanished through the door. The sword seemed to grow heavier with each heartbeat. Eleanor had seen Henry's note still folded in her purse when she reached for the dagger. The note she was meant to burn, the oath she was meant to keep. Now she would add one more secret to the tally. Robert Harclay appeared, his lank hair plastered to his forehead from the damp, his eyes wary. He had served the household since before Lord Whitmore's fever took him, and he knew better than to ask why his lady stood armed in the dark. You'll take word to a man, Eleanor said. His name is William Ashford. He leads a band of Lancastrian survivors somewhere in the rock cuts north of the high moor. I don't know where he hides, but I know how he thinks. Go to the boundary stone on the northern edge, the one with the fresh chisel marks along its edge. Leave 3 pebbles in a line beneath it, pointing east. He'll find them. Robert's throat bobbed. My lady, if the patrols. You're a tenant seeking a stray ewe. The shepherds know your face. She pressed a silver penny into his hand, the coin warm from her purse. If he answers, tell him to meet me at the old oak where the drover's road forks at the stream. He'll know the place. Say only this. The swan remembers the still water. Repeat it. The swan remembers the still water. Robert said, the words clumsy on his tongue. Good. Now go, and don't be seen. He left, and the door groaned shut. Matilda stepped back inside, her expression unreadable. I've sent young Dickon to sit with the dying man in the undercroft, and I've told Father Ambrose to keep his prayers quiet. The horses are in the yard. Are you truly going to meet Ashford? After all these years? Eleanor sheathed the sword at her hip, the motion still strange to her, the scabbard banging against her thigh through the torn wool of the nun's habit. He's the only Lancastrian commander within reach who isn't already riding into the trap. Henry's still a day away, if he's not been delayed. Ashford has men, and he knows the moor. He also knows you jilted him for a Yorkist lord, Matilda said flatly. Men don't forget that. Then I'll remind him what else he shouldn't forget. Eleanor pulled her woolen cloak tight and walked toward the yard. Saddle the grey for me, and the bay for yourself. We ride light. The moor at dusk was a bruise of purple and grey, the heather beaten flat by the wind that had harried the hills since Hexham. Eleanor and Matilda followed the drover's road north, the horses' hooves sucking at the wet ground, until the silhouette of the old oak rose against the fading light. a twisted giant whose roots clutched the bank of a narrow stream. They dismounted, and Matilda held the reins while Eleanor walked to the water's edge. She did not have to wait long. A shadow detached itself from the scrub where no shadow should have been. A man who had learned to move like smoke through gorse and rock. He was tall and lean, with a face that had once been handsome in a high-boned way and was now carved by privation. Cheeks hollowed, jaw sharpened, a thin white scar running from his left brow to his temple. His hair was dark and ragged, streaked with grey at the temples, and his eyes were the colour of flint struck in a dark room, hard, hot, waiting for a spark. He wore a patched leather jerkin over a gambeson stained with old mud, and the sword at his hip was a gentleman's weapon, lighter than Eleanor's, but its hilt was worn smooth by use. Behind him, a younger man with a raw, watchful face hovered at the edge of the oak's shadow, a strung bough held loosely at his side. William Ashford raised a hand, and the young man melted back into the darkness. Eleanor. His voice was rough, scraped raw by wind and silence. I thought you'd forgotten that phrase, or forgotten me. She met his eyes, those flint-bright eyes, and felt the old pull in her chest. The memory of a girl standing in a sunlit garden, while a young knight with a laugh like running water promised her a future her family would not allow. I forgot nothing, she said. Though God knows I tried. He stepped closer, and the scar on his brow seemed to whiten. You married Henry Whitmore before my letter reached you. You walked into that Yorkist hall and said your vows while I was bleeding into the mud at Towton. Do you know what that did to me? I know what it did to me, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I was 17, William. My father commanded, and I obeyed. I've spent 10 years obeying. First my father, then my husband, then the silence that kept this estate from being swallowed by men like Hargrave. That silence ends tonight. Hargrave. William's mouth twisted. Robert Hargrave. He tried to kill me at Towton, ran his horse at my flank and left me for dead in a ditch. And now you're telling me he's here? He's been circling Whitmore for 3 years, since my husband died of a fever. Twice he's petitioned the king for my hand and my lands, and twice the king refused him, but now he's found another way. She drew a breath. The king has ordered an ambush on a Lancastrian truce party. Dawn tomorrow on the moor, the truce-bearers ride south under a flag, expecting bread and salt and parley. Instead, Hargrave's men will cut them down, and then they'll plant a Yorkist surcoat and forged letters on my northern boundary. That evidence will attaint me as a traitor, and Hargrave will take Whitmore by legal theft. My son will be declared a traitor's get, and everything I've held together will burn. William stared at her. The bitterness in his face warred with something older, something that had never quite been extinguished. And you come to me, a Lancastrian fugitive hiding in the rocks with a dozen men who have nothing but their swords and their hunger. What do you expect me to do? I expect you to help me save Lancastrian lives, Eleanor said. Those men riding south are your comrades. They believe the king means to offer terms. Instead, they'll find knives in the dark. You know the moor better than any Yorkist patrol. You always did, even when we were young. And I have word, from a dying man who carried the order himself, that the ambush will spring from a place called the Viking Scar. Something shifted in William's face. He looked at her for a long moment, then laughed. A short, humourless sound. The Viking Scar. Aye, I know it. A deep ravine on the eastern moor, hidden by gorse and old rock falls. If Hargrave's chosen that, he's cleverer than I thought. The scar has only one obvious entrance, from the south, but there's a shepherd's track into it from the east, a cleft in the rock marked by a stunted hawthorn. My men use it to move between the high ground and the low. No one else knows it's there. Eleanor's heart hammered. Could you get men into the scar before dawn? If I move them tonight, in the dark, yes, but we'd need a distraction, something to pull Hargrave's eyes to the south while we position ourselves inside the ravine from the east. Then I will give you a distraction, Eleanor said. There is a beacon cairn on the North Tor above the Drovers' Road. If I light it, the Yorkist patrols will think the Lancastrians are signalling from the high ground. They'll turn their attention north, and you can slip through. From behind her, Matilda's voice cut through the dark. It's suicide, my lady. They'll see the flame and ride straight for you. They'll ride for the Tor, Eleanor said, not turning. I won't be on it when they arrive. She held William's gaze. Afterward, if we succeed, I can offer shelter. The undercroft at Whitmore is hidden. I can hide your wounded, provision your men for a time. It isn't much, but it's more than a rock cleft in the rain. William stepped closer still, close enough that she could smell the moor on him, peat and damp wool and something sharp like sweat and old leather. The young man with the bow made a warning sound in his throat, but William ignored him. You're asking me to trust you, he said, his voice low. The woman who broke her vow to me for a Yorkist marriage, the woman whose hall flies a Yorkist pennant as we speak. "The pennant is not mine," Eleanor said. "And that marriage, I did not choose it. But I did my duty in it. Lord Whitmore was a decent man. He gave me my son, and when he died, he left me a house I mean to keep. If you cannot forgive me, then help me for the sake of the men riding into that trap. They have wives and sons, too." He looked at her, and the years seemed to stretch between them. 10 years of war and widowhood and hiding in the stones. Then, slowly, the hardness in his face cracked, and something gentler rose beneath it, like water seeping through rock. "We were always on opposite sides of a chessboard, Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd rather flip the board and fight beside you than checkmate you alone." She felt the weight of it, the old wound, the new alliance, the thread of something that had never truly snapped. "Then it's settled," she said. "Gather your men and move for the eastern cleft. I will light the beacon at the 3rd hour of the night, when the moon is low. That will give you time to reach the scar before the first light." William nodded. "I'll need to know the signal when the ambush is broken. If we succeed, I'll send a man to the boundary stone with 2 pebbles crossed. That will mean we've scattered them and the truce party is safe." "I'll watch for it," Eleanor said. He hesitated, then reached out and touched her arm. Just once, his fingers light against the torn wool of her sleeve. "Be careful, Eleanor. If Hargrave catches you before we can act, he won't wait for a trial. He'll hang you from your own gatehouse and call it justice." "I know," she said. "Go. We have no time." He turned and vanished into the scrub, the young archer melting after him, and within 3 heartbeats they were gone, swallowed by the gorse and the gathering dark, as if they had never been there at all. Matilda brought the horses forward, her face set. "Well, did he curse you or kiss you?" "Neither," Eleanor said, swinging into the saddle. "But he'll fight. That's enough." She turned the grey's head toward the North Tor, where the beacon cairn waited, a pile of old wood and bracken that she had ordered laid years ago against the threat of Scottish raiders. Now it would serve a different purpose, a light in the darkness, drawing the hounds away from the sheep. "Ride," she said to Matilda. "We have a fire to light and a trap to spring." They spurred the horses forward, and the moor swallowed them whole. The iron-shod hooves sounded first, a low thunder rolling up the track from the southern road. Too many horses for a patrol, too steady for men riding blind. Eleanor heard them from the undercroft, where she crouched beside Thomas Holbrook's pallet, pressing a damp cloth to the heat blooming beneath his skin. His breath came shallow and fast, each exhale flecked with a sound she had learned to dread, the wet rattle of a wound turning foul. "Someone's coming," she said. Matilda appeared at the top of the steps, her face tight. "Armed men, my lady, a dozen at least, and at their head." She did not need to finish. The name hung between them like smoke. Sir Robert Hargrave had come calling. Eleanor straightened. The torn nun's habit still clung to her frame beneath the woolen cloak she had thrown over it. There had been no time to change, no time to do anything but watch Thomas sink deeper into fever and wait for the beacon hour to arrive. "Get him up," she said, nodding at Thomas. "The priest hole in the chapel wall. Father Ambrose knows the panel. Tell him I said to keep silence for the love of God." Matilda hesitated only a heartbeat before she was at the pallet, hauling Thomas upright with a strength that belied her raw-boned frame. He moaned, eyes fluttering open, murky brown, the colour of river water after a flood. "What? Hargrave," Eleanor said. "You will be silent. Thomas Holbrook, or you will be dead before dawn finds its way to the scar." "Do you understand?" He understood. She saw it in the way his jaw clamped shut, even as his body sagged against Matilda's shoulder. By the time Eleanor climbed the steps into the great hall, the hoofbeats had ceased. Through the high windows, torchlight danced red against the night. Hargrave's men dismounting in the yard, their breastplates catching the glow. She smoothed the cloak across her chest and walked to the door. Sir Robert Hargrave was not a tall man, but he carried himself as though he were, shoulders squared beneath a brigandine of dark oxblood leather studded with steel. His face was a careful construction, a jaw that had learned to smile without warmth, eyes the colour of tarnished pewter beneath brows that met in a single hard line. A thin mouth, pursed now as if tasting something sour. His hair was iron grey and cropped close to the skull, receding at the temples in a way that made his forehead seem too high, too exposed. He looked, Eleanor had always thought, like a man who had spent his life calculating the price of things and found most of them wanting. Lady Whitmore. He swept a shallow bow, the kind that cost him nothing. "I trust I find you well. My hospitality is usually given to those who send word ahead," she said. "But you are here now. What would you have of me, Sir Robert?" His smile did not reach his eyes. "I am searching for a deserter. One of my men. A Thomas Holbrook, perhaps 40, with a face carved by hardship and a tendency toward disloyalty. He was seen on the moor road 3 days past, heading toward your lands. Have you seen him?" "I have seen many things on the moor road." A dead man in a Yorkist surcoat, a patrol from Montague's company, a priest with an arrow in his shoulder, no deserters. She held his gaze. But you are welcome to search the grounds if my word is not enough. It is not. The words were silk over steel. Your late husband understood the necessity of bending the knee, Lady Whitmore. Pity he didn't teach you before he fell at Towton. The blow landed, but she had spent 10 years learning not to flinch. My husband died of a fever, Sir Robert, 3 years past. I am surprised a man of your memory forgets such things. Towton. A fever. Both take a man to the same cold ground. He gestured to the men behind him, a dozen Yorkist men-at-arms, their surcoats bearing the lions of England. Search the hall, the outbuildings, the chapel. Be thorough. Eleanor did not move from the doorway. The chapel is a house of God. Father Ambrose lies wounded within. You will disturb his rest at your soul's peril. Then I will pray for my soul. Hargrave stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the oiled leather of his brigandine and the sour wine on his breath. You think I do not know what you are, Eleanor? A trimmer, a fence-sitter. You wed a Yorkist when it suited your father, and now you harbour Lancastrians when it suits your conscience. But the king's patience is a finite thing, and mine is shorter still. Her hand, hidden beneath the cloak, found the hilt of the dagger in her purse, the plain steel blade, the leather grip darkened by Matilda's father's sweat. She did not draw it, she did not need to. The weight was enough. Search what you will, she said, you will find nothing. They searched. She stood in the yard and watched the torches move through her home. Into the kitchen, the storerooms, the stables where the grey and bay still stood saddled. Into the chapel, where she forced her breathing to remain even. The priest hole was behind the carved panel of St. Cuthbert, cut into the wall during her husband's grandfather's time, when Lancastrian raiders had come through the north and hidden Catholics had needed places to pray. The panel fit flush, the seam invisible in torchlight, but if Thomas coughed, if Ambrose shifted wrong, minutes stretched. The men returned, empty-handed. Hargrave's pewter eyes flickered with something between frustration and suspicion. It seems I must apologize for the intrusion, he said, in a tone that suggested apology was a foreign language he had never troubled to learn. But I would offer you a piece of counsel before I go. The king's justice is coming to this moor. When it arrives, it will not distinguish between the guilty and the silent. You would do well to choose a side before one is chosen for you. I will consider it, Eleanor said. He mounted his horse, a great bay destrier with a white blaze, and wheeled it toward the gate. The troop followed, their torches receding down the track, until they were only distant sparks against the blackness of the moor. She waited until the last spark vanished before she ran. The priest hole was dark and close, smelling of old stone and the copper tang of blood. Matilda had stretched Thomas on a pallet of folded cloaks. Ambrose knelt beside him, his bandaged shoulder dark with fresh seepage, his mild grey eyes fixed on the dying man with the resignation of one who had administered too many last rites. He's asking for you, Matilda said. Eleanor dropped to her knees. Thomas Holbrook's face was waxen now, the grey pallor beneath his skin deepening to something like ash. But his eyes were open, and in them there was a terrible clarity, the brief, bright moment that sometimes came just before the end. My lady, he breathed. Did he go? He went, he found nothing. You are safe, safe. A smile ghosted across his cracked lips. I have not been safe since Hexham, but I have been heard. That is something. His hand fumbled at his chest beneath the torn gambeson, and emerged clutching a folded square of parchment creased and stained with sweat. The wax seal had cracked, but the impression was still visible in the candlelight. The royal arms of England, the lion and the fleur-de-lis. What is this? She asked, though she already knew. The order, he said, not the writ. That's with the bishop now, Godspeed it. This is the order Hargrave carries, signed by the king's own hand. Ambush the truce party, plant the surcoat, burn the hall if they must. His grip tightened on her wrist with the last strength he possessed. He dropped it. When we rode through the ford at Wansbeck, he fell and his saddlebag opened and I saw it in the mud. I took it. I knew I would need proof. Something to trade for my soul. The parchment trembled in Eleanor's hand. She did not open it. She did not need to. You carried this across the moor, she said. Wounded. Hunted. I carried that order, my lady. His voice cracked, and for a moment he was not a soldier but a man staring into the darkness of his own ending. I saw them smile at the thought of dead children. I can't carry it to hell. The words settled into her chest like stones into still water. She had heard them before, in the Undercroft, when he first unburdened himself, but now they carried a different weight. Now they were a dying man's last confession. Then do not carry it, she said. Leave it with me. I will carry it instead. His eyes widened, then softened. You will use it? I will use it. She closed her fingers around the parchment. Hargrave will answer for what he has done, what he means to do. I swear this to you, Thomas Holbrook, on my husband's sword and on my son's life. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to draw all the tension from his ravaged body. Father Ambrose began the prayers for the dying, his voice a low murmur like rain on slate. Matilda bowed her head. And Eleanor, still gripping the evidence that could damn a king's favourite and save a truce party's souls, watched Thomas Holbrook's murky brown eyes go still at last. The undercroft was silent. Somewhere above, a wind stirred across the moor, rattling the chapel's leaded windows. Somewhere north of the high tor, a beacon waited to be lit. Eleanor rose. The parchment was cold in her hand, but beneath the cold she felt something kindle, small and fierce, like the first spark struck from flint. "Matilda," she said, "the horses are still saddled. We ride for the north tor, the beacon." The beacon. She tucked the parchment into her purse beside Henry's unburned note and the drover's knife. And then, Hargrave's gambit ends. The moor at night was a different creature, alive with the sound of wind in the heather and the distant cry of a curlew, the darkness so complete that Eleanor could see nothing beyond the grey mare's ears save the faint silver ribbon of the drover's road unwinding beneath them. She had shed the torn nun's habit in the chapel before riding out, replacing it with a plain wool riding cloak the colour of peat smoke, but the Wimple's ghost still chafed her throat where the rough cloth had left its mark. Matilda rode beside her, the bay plodding steady on the uneven ground, her lantern shuttered to a thin blade of light that showed only the next few yards of track. They had lit the beacon. The north tor behind them still burned. A fist of orange and crimson punching at the night sky, visible for miles across the moor, a signal that would pull every Yorkist eye northward, while William Ashford and his Lancastrians slipped through the eastern cleft into the Vikings' scar. Now they rode not toward the fire but away from it, cutting east across the heather-choked slope, and ahead of them a shape detached itself from the deeper dark of a stunted hawthorn. Lady Whitmore. The voice was low, hard, with an edge worn by months of sleeping in the open. A tall man stepped forward, lean as a wolf, his dark hair ragged and streaked with grey at the temples, a thin white scar slicing from left brow to temple. William Ashford's eyes were the colour of flint, hard and bright even in the darkness, and they swept over her with something that was not quite welcome and not quite suspicion. Something older, more tangled. "You came. The beacon will draw them north," Eleanor said, reining in the grey. Behind Ashford, she could see the shapes of his men. A dozen Lancastrian survivors, their faces hollowed by privation, their weapons a motley collection of rusted swords and hunting bows, and one long-handled billhook that had seen better days. A young archer with a nervous hand on his bowstring watched her with open wariness. But Hargrave will have men at the scar already. He means to strike at dawn when the truce party rides into the ravine. Ashford's jaw tightened. "Then we move now. Before the light finds us." He turned and began walking eastward into the dark, and his men fell in behind him without a word. Eleanor dismounted and handed the grey's reins to Matilda, who took them with a face that was seamed by weather into something unreadable. "You'll wait here?" Eleanor asked. "I'll wait until I hear the screaming," Matilda said quietly. "Then I'll pray. Go. He's not a patient man, from what you've told me." The eastern approach to the Viking scar was no proper track at all, only a sheep path that wound between gorse thickets and tumbles of fallen rock, invisible unless you knew to look for the stunted hawthorn that marked its start. Ashford's men moved through it like wraiths, their footfalls soft on the moss, and Eleanor followed, her husband's sword heavy at her hip, the weight of the king's order in her purse, a constant reminder of what they were about to do. The mist rose as they descended, curling up from the ravine floor in pale tendrils that clung to their cloaks and muffled the sound of their passage. A stone turned under Eleanor's foot, and she stumbled, catching herself on a moss-slick boulder. Ashford's hand closed on her elbow, steadying her, and for a moment they stood close in the dark, his breath warm against her temple. "You're not a woman who stumbles," he murmured, and the words were not quite kind but not unkind. A soldier's assessment, flat and measuring. "These rocks were not here when I last walked this path," she said. "I was 17. Something flickered in his face. The memory of that summer, perhaps, before her father broke the betrothal, before she was married to Henry Whitmore and William rode south to fight under the Lancastrian banner. Before Towton, before the scar, before the bitter years of hiding in rock cuts while Yorkist patrols swept the moor. "We were different people then," he said, releasing her arm. "Yes," she said. "We were children." They continued down at the foot of the sheep path where the ravine walls rose sheer on either side, and the floor was choked with bracken and fallen scree. Ashford raised his hand. His men stopped. Ahead, through the mist, Eleanor could hear it. The low murmur of voices, the clink of harness, the occasional stamp of a hoof against cold ground. Hargrave's men. They were arrayed along the southern lip of the scar, hidden in the gorse and rock falls, waiting for the Lancastrian truce party to ride into the trap. The young archer crept forward, his bow half drawn, and peered through the mist. Then he turned back to Ashford and held up both hands, fingers splayed. 10, he mouthed. Then another gesture, palm down, sweeping outward. Spread along the ridge. Ashford nodded once. He looked at Eleanor. Stay back, you've done enough. No, she said. I have not. She drew her husband's sword. The blade came free with a whisper of steel that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the ravine, and the weight of it in her hand was both familiar and alien. She had polished that sword 100 times, hung above the mantel since Lord Whitmore's burial 3 years past, but she had never swung it in anger. That was about to change. Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a thin, wolfish expression that held no humour at all, and turned to his men. With me, he said. Quiet, until we're on them, then give them hell. The mist was their ally. It swallowed the sound of their advance as Ashford's Lancastrians climbed the northern slope of the ravine, circling behind the Yorkist position. The first guard died without a sound. The young archer put an arrow through his throat from 10 paces, and the man toppled sideways into the bracken, his crossbow clattering against stone. The second guard turned at the noise, his mouth opening to shout, and then Ashford was on him, driving a dagger up under his jaw. But the third man saw them. Behind us, he roared, and then the mist erupted into chaos. Eleanor had no time to think. A Yorkist soldier came at her out of the fog, his sword a blur of steel, and she parried by instinct, the heavy blade jarring her arms from wrist to shoulder. He was young, perhaps 18, with a thin red scar running from temple to jaw, the same rider who had grabbed her on the moor days before, his eyes widening in recognition. You, he snarled, and pressed forward, forcing her back against the ravine wall. She was not strong enough for this. She knew it the way a drowning woman knows the water is too deep. But she had not come here to be strong. She had come here to be a distraction, to buy Ashford time, and if that meant dying in the mud of the scar with her husband's sword in her hand, then so be it. She ducked under his swing, feeling the wind of the blade pass an inch above her head, and drove the pommel of her sword into his scarred face. He reeled backward, blood streaming from his nose, and she followed, swinging the blade in a desperate arc that caught him across the thigh. He went down screaming. The skirmish raged around her. Ashford's men had taken the Yorkists by surprise, cutting down half of them before the rest could form a defensive line. She saw the young archer loose shaft after shaft into the mist, saw a Lancastrian with an axe cleave a Yorkist helmet in two, saw a man she did not know fall with a gurgling cry as a blade took him in the throat, and then she saw Hargrave. Sir Robert Hargrave was not a tall man, but he carried himself with a squared posture that made him seem larger, and his oxblood brigandine gleamed wetly in the faint light of the dying beacon on the northern tor. His tarnished pewter eyes found Eleanor across the chaos of the skirmish, and his face, that hard, solid face with brows that met in a single line, twisted into something between fury and savage delight. You, he said, and the word was almost a caress. I knew it. I knew you were a traitor from the moment you refused my hand. He came at her with his sword drawn, and Eleanor raised her blade to meet him, knowing even as she did that she could not match him. He was a knight who had fought at Towton, a man who had spent his whole life learning to kill, and she was a widow who had spent hers learning to survive. Their swords met once, twice, the impact jarring her teeth. On the third stroke his blade twisted and hers flew from her grasp, spinning away into the darkness. She stumbled, reaching for the drover's knife in her purse, but Hargrave was already raising his sword for the killing blow. I told your husband once, he said, that he should have bent the knee. Now I'll. The blade that punched through his chest from behind stopped the words in his throat. Hargrave looked down at the steel protruding from his brigandine, his pewter eyes wide with incomprehension, and then William Ashford's voice came from behind him, low and cold as a winter stream. You'll die with my name on your lips, and I won't even give you the courtesy of saying it. Ashford pulled his sword free, and Sir Robert Hargrave collapsed into the mud of the Viking's scar, his blood pooling black in the mistlight. It was not over. The Yorkist archer had climbed to a high rock above the ravine, and even as the Lancastrian nobles, warned by the chaos of the skirmish, wheeled their horses and fled southward into the safety of the moor, the archer drew his bow. He was aiming at Ashford, who stood over Hargrave's body, his sword still dripping. Eleanor did not think. She could not think. There was only the drover's knife in her hand, plain steel, leather-wrapped grip, a blade old Matilda's father had used to keep wolves from the herd, and the distance between her and the archer, and the knowledge that if he loosed that arrow, William Ashford would die. The throw was clumsy, desperate, a woman's throw with no training behind it. But the blade found its mark, the archer's shoulder, not his heart, but enough to spoil his aim. The arrow flew wide, skittering off the rocks above Ashford's head, and the archer staggered, clutching at the hilt protruding from his flesh. One of Ashford's men finished him a moment later. Eleanor stood in the mud of the scar, her hands empty, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked at what she had done. A man was dead by her hand. She had thrown a knife with intent to kill. The innocence she had clung to for 30 years, the fiction that she could walk the blade's edge without falling, had shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Ashford was at her side, his flint-coloured eyes searching her face. "You saved my life? Don't," she said. Her voice was not her own, too thin, too hollow. "Don't make it noble. I killed a man." "You killed a man who would have killed me," he said. "That is the mathematics of war, Eleanor. You learn to do the sums." She looked at him, at the thin white scar that ran from his brow to his temple, at the grey streaking the dark hair at his temples. And she thought of the girl she had been at 17, who had loved this man and left him, and the woman she had become, who had just killed for him. "The truce party is safe," she said. "Hargrave is dead. We've done what we came to do. We've changed the game," Ashford said. He looked at the bodies scattered across the ravine floor, at his surviving men, fewer now, bloodied but alive, and his jaw set. "But the king's men will know who did this. They'll see your beacon. They'll find Hargrave's body, and they'll come for Whitmore Hall." "Let them come," Eleanor said. She bent and retrieved her husband's sword from where it had fallen, the blade now chipped and fouled with mud and blood. "I have the king's own order in my purse. Let them explain why Sir Robert Hargrave carried a signed command to butcher men under a flag of truce." Ashford stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned to his men. "We retreat," he said, "through the cleft before the rest of Hargrave's patrol arrives. Move." The Lancastrians melted into the mist, dragging their wounded with them, leaving the dead behind. Eleanor followed, her husband's sword heavy in her hand, the drover's knife still buried in a dead archer's shoulder, and behind her the beacon on the North Tor still burned against the sky, a signal that had been meant to mislead, but now told everyone who cared to look that the war had come to Whitmore. The eastern cleft was a wound in the moor, a narrow slash of rock and scree that climbed from the Viking scar toward the high ground. Eleanor's legs burned with the ascent, her husband's sword heavy in her hand, the blade fouled dark with mud and blood she could not name. Behind her, Ashford's Lancastrians moved in a loose file. 8 men, perhaps 9, their breath clouding in the cold air, their boots scraping stone. Somewhere ahead, the beacon on the North Tor still burned, a dull orange smear against the thinning dark. Ashford walked at her shoulder, his flint-coloured eyes scanning the ridgeline. The thin, white scar at his temple caught the faint light. He had not spoken since they left the scar, but his silence was not cold. It was the quiet of a man conserving words for when they mattered. They found Matilda Croft where she had promised to wait, in the lee of the stunted hawthorn that marked the sheep path. The grey mare and the bay stood tethered beside her, their breath pluming in the chill. Matilda's raw-boned frame was rigid with cold, her seamed face half hidden by the shuttered lantern she held, but her eyes were sharp and watchful. She stepped forward as Eleanor emerged from the cleft. "My lady." Her gaze took in the sword, the fouled cloak, the dark spatter across Eleanor's sleeve. She asked no questions. Instead, she unlashed the grey mare's reins and held them out. "The hall?" "The hall." Eleanor's voice was hoarse, scraped raw. She turned to Ashford. "Your men." "We'll keep to the high ground," he said. "The Yorkists will send patrols at first light. If they find us in the open, it's a rope for every man. Better we go to ground and watch, and if they come for the hall," his jaw tightened, "then send word." The same signal, 3 pebbles at the boundary stone. "I'll come." Eleanor swung into the saddle, the movement pulling at muscles she had not known she possessed. The grey mare sidestepped, smelling the blood on her. She steadied it with a hand that trembled only slightly. "William." She looked down at him, the name strange and familiar on her tongue. "Hargrave is dead. That changes everything. I know." He reached up, and for a moment his fingers brushed her wrist, a touch as brief as it was deliberate. "You carry the proof now. Use it." Then he was gone, melting back into the cleft with his men, and Eleanor was riding west with Matilda at her side, the horses finding their pace across the dark moor. Dawn came slow and grey, seeping over the eastern hills like water into cloth. By the time Eleanor and Matilda rode through the gate of Whitmore Hall, the sky was the colour of tarnished pewter, and the beacon on the North Tor had burned down to a smudge of smoke. The household was already stirring in the grip of confusion. Dickon, the stable boy, stood in the yard with his mouth half open, his hands twisting in his tunic. Behind him, Simon the Reaper had gathered a knot of tenants near the gatehouse. Men with pitchforks and wood axes, their stooped shoulders rigid with unease. They saw the beacon, Matilda said quietly, dismounting. They know something's wrong. Eleanor slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling. She thrust the reins at Dickon. Rouse every man who can hold a staff or a billhook. Bar the gate. I want the hall sealed before the sun clears the rooftops. My lady, Dickon began. Now. He ran. Father Ambrose appeared in the chapel doorway, his mild grey eyes sunken with pain, one hand pressed to his bandaged shoulder. His thinning white hair stood in disarray, and his cassock was still smeared with the blood of Thomas Holbrook. He said nothing, only watched as Eleanor crossed the yard with her fouled sword still in her grip. Father, she said, pausing. Holbrook's body remains in the priest hole, the old priest said. I thought it best not to move him until you returned. Good, she swallowed. I may need to show him what he carried, what he died for. Ambrose's gaze moved to the blood on her cloak. You have been in battle. Yes, he made the sign of the cross, his hand trembling. Then God have mercy on us all. The barricades were crude but serviceable. Simon's men stacked hay wains across the gatehouse arch and propped heavy timbers against the postern door. The tenants, 12 in all, farmers and shepherds with weathered faces and calloused hands, took up positions along the low stone wall that ringed the hall. Some carried hunting bows. Most had only billhooks sharpened that morning on whetstones. Eleanor stood in the centre of the yard, still in her riding cloak, her husband's sword now cleaned and belted at her waist. In her purse, folded against her hip, rested the king's ambush order, the parchment Holbrook had died to deliver. Matilda came to stand beside her. If they bring a full company, they won't need a full company to take this hall, Eleanor said. We have 12 men and a priest with one good arm. That's not a garrison. That's a gesture. Then what are we doing? We are buying time. Eleanor's eyes swept the wall, the gate, the pale faces of the tenants who had trusted the Whitmore name for 3 generations, and we are forcing them to look us in the eye. The first horsemen appeared as the sun broke over the eastern ridge. There were perhaps 20 of them, riding in loose formation along the track that led from the moor. Their livery was the sun in splendour, the same crimson badge Hargrave had worn, the same badge on the surcoat still hidden in Eleanor's undercroft. At their head rode a thick-set man with a face like a fist and a close-cropped beard. Eleanor knew him instantly. Captain Hugh Dryden had returned. He reined in at the edge of the gatehouse clearing, his narrowed eyes surveying the barricades, the armed tenants, the locked gate. His men spread out behind him in a crescent, hands resting on sword hilts. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Dryden raised his voice. Lady Whitmore, I received word in the night. A beacon burning on the North Tor, and Sir Robert Hargrave's patrol missing. I find your hall barred like a fortress and your tenants armed like foot soldiers. I trust there is an explanation. Eleanor stepped up onto the mounting block beside the gate, bringing herself to eye level with the captain. In her hand she held the folded parchment. There is, Captain. Sir Robert Hargrave is dead. He died attempting to murder a party of Lancastrian peace envoys under a flag of truce, on the order of King Edward himself. A murmur ran through Dryden's men. The captain's face darkened. That is a dangerous accusation, my lady. It is a documented one. She held up the parchment, letting the cracked royal seal catch the morning light. This is the king's signed order, taken from Hargrave's own saddlebag. It commands him to ambush the truce party, plant a Yorkist surcoat on my land, and burn this hall if I resisted. The king's hand. The king's seal. The king's treachery. Dryden's horse shifted beneath him. He was a hard man, a soldier of Lord Montague's company, but he was not a fool. He understood what he was looking at. Who else has seen this document? I have, said Father Ambrose, stepping forward from the chapel door. His voice was steady despite the pain in his shoulder. And I will swear to its contents before any ecclesiastical court in England. As will I, Matilda said. And I, said Simon the Reaper, his voice cracking but firm. Eleanor met Dryden's eyes. You hold my signed oath, Captain. A piece of paper I gave you under duress denouncing a dead man. I hold a piece of paper that could bring down a king. Shall we compare their weight? The silence stretched. A wind stirred the heather beyond the wall. Somewhere a curlew called Dryden's jaw worked. What do you want? A truce, withdraw your men. No retribution against Whitmore Hall, its tenants or its household. In exchange, I will not send copies of this order to every noble house in the north. The Percys, the Nevilles, the Cliffords. Men who might wonder what other orders Edward has signed. Men who might reconsider their oaths. You would threaten the king's peace. I would preserve mine. Her voice hardened. My neutrality has been a shield, but now I see it was a cage. It's time to unsheathe the sword beneath the silk. Dryden stared at her. In his eyes, she saw the calculation. The cost of storming the hall against the cost of retreating, the scandal of the order against the scandal of defying her. He was a practical man, and practical men knew when the arithmetic was against them. "Lower your weapons," he said finally to his men. Then to Eleanor, "You understand this changes nothing in the long term. You have made enemies today who will not forget." "I have made enemies every day since my husband died," she said. "At least now I know their names." The captain turned his horse. His men followed, falling back along the track in a slow, grudging retreat. The sun climbed higher, burning the last of the mist from the moor. Eleanor stood on the mounting block until the last horseman vanished over the ridge. Then she climbed down, her legs steady now, her hand resting on the purse at her hip. Matilda was there, her weathered face unreadable. "We won. We survived," Eleanor said. "That's not the same thing." She walked the battlements alone an hour later, as the hall settled back into uneasy quiet. The wall was low and old, more boundary than fortification, but it gave her a view of the moor stretching east toward the sea. The beacon on the north tor had died at last, its smoke a faint grey thread against the pale sky. She thought of William Ashby, the dying man who had set all this in motion. She thought of Holbrook, who had stolen the truth and carried it to her doorstep. She thought of Hargrave, who had tried to take everything and now lay cold in the ravine. She thought of the scarred young rider, still lying somewhere in the scar, and wondered if he was dead or merely dying. She thought of Benjamin, in York, and of Henry, riding south with his armed men, and of Ashford, hidden among the rocks, waiting for a signal that might never come. The war had come to Whitmore Hall, not with trumpets and banners, but with a piece of parchment and a dead man's confession. And she had chosen her side. Not York, not Lancaster, but the truth. The truth was a blade, and she had drawn it. Below her, in the yard, Father Ambrose was leading the tenants in a murmured prayer. Matilda was directing the clearing of the barricades. Somewhere a cock crowed, as if this were any other morning. Eleanor looked east, toward the rising sun. "Let them come," she whispered. And this time she did not mean Hargrave.